Currently, there are signs within Cuba that seem to indicate preparations for a US invasion. According to a recent Axios report, Cuba has even prepared drones to attack the United States. Let's take a closer look at this today. Let's take a look. According to the Axios report on May 17, Cuba has secured more than 300 military drones from Iran and Russia, and it was reported that they have recently begun discussing plans to use these drones to attack the US military base at Guantanamo in Cuba, US naval vessels, and even Key West in Florida. Since 2023, Cuba has secured various attack drones from Russia. It is said that these have been deployed at strategic points throughout Cuba. Cuba reportedly requested more drones and military gear from Russia in the past month. In fact, Cuba sent troops to Russia not as the Cuban military, but in the form of individual volunteer soldiers, and the number is said to be as many as 5,000. Russia reportedly paid the Cuban government about $25,000 per person, or 37.5 million won for sending troops. The surviving Cubans advanced modern warfare for the Cuban military, reportedly improving its quality. The Axios report is significant. At the moment, there are no observed military movements indicating that the United States is planning to attack Cuba. Because President Trump keeps making strong statements about attacking Cuba, people in Cuba are taking this very seriously and seem to be continuing their preparations for war. According to Axios, the Trump administration is concerned about Cuba's development of drone tactics and the presence of Iranian military advisors in Cuba. They analyze that actions like Cuba's war preparations could become a justification for future US military action against Cuba. Naturally, when these reports came out, the Cuban side reacted very angrily, especially after reports emerged that the US was considering attacking Cuba. The Cuban government claimed that the Trump administration was fabricating false claims to create a pretext for attacking Cuba. Bruno Rodriguez, the Cuban foreign minister, wrote on X that the US government is increasingly creating fabricated justifications to legitimize its harsh economic war and military attacks against the Cuban people, and pointed out that some media outlets are spreading false information from the US government. He also stated that Cuba does not threaten anyone and does not want war. However, it is a fact that Cuba is showing signs of preparing for a possible US invasion. Carlos Fernandez, Cuba's deputy foreign minister, said that while he does not believe an invasion is likely, it would be naive not to prepare for it. He also said that historically, the entire country has been prepared to mobilize against military aggression, and that the military is always ready and currently preparing for the possibility of a US invasion. There are also currently rumors about the indictment of former Chairman Castro. Since Castro is such a symbolic figure in Cuba, Cuba is unlikely to comply with US demands. Because of this, there is talk that the US could attack Cuba using this as a pretext, just as it did with Venezuela. As a result, Cuba is continuing its war preparations even more. Cuban state media has reported on civilians receiving military training as part of Fidel Castro's concept of a war of the entire people, which envisions the Cuban people waging guerrilla warfare against foreign invasion. Recently, a survival guide titled Protect, Resist, Survive, and Win was posted on a Cuban local government website, providing instructions on how to protect lives in the face of a possible invasion. Of course, if the US invades Cuba under current circumstances, it seems inevitable that Cuba would be overwhelmed. However, there is analysis that the Cuban military could engage in prolonged resistance even under poor conditions. According to CNN, Cuba has the ability to mobilize and evacuate its population, and even with a lack of modern weapons, could continue stubborn resistance in ground warfare. Above all, President Diaz-Canel of Cuba has said that they are actively preparing for the possibility of a US military attack, and that they have a responsibility to protect their people and defend their homeland. He stated, "We are in a defensive posture, but our doctrine is entirely defensive. We believe that maintaining a defensive posture is the best way to avoid war and preserve peace." Currently, the US is demanding the release of political prisoners and the implementation of multi-party elections in Cuba. The US is also demanding that Cuba recognize labor unions and freedom of the press, but President Diaz-Canel has said that dialogue and reaching an agreement on these issues will not be easy. Given the current situation, it seems likely that Cuba will fight to the end, but the problem is that Cuba's situation is not very good. According to Axios, the situation is so serious that it is reported to be the closest Cuba has come to regime collapse since the 1959 revolution. Currently, the United States is heavily pressuring and sanctioning Cuba, and Venezuela, once supplying over 100,000 barrels of subsidized oil daily, has ended its support. In January, after President Maduro's arrest, Venezuela withdrew support. By late March, a Russian tanker delivered 730,000 barrels of crude oil, which were reportedly used up by early April. Currently, fuel is virtually completely depleted. As a result, Cuba is experiencing power outages that last more than 20 hours a day. Power outages last 20 to 22 hours daily. The national grid uses domestic crude oil, natural gas, and renewables, but that's far from sufficient. Due to Cuba's energy shortage, public services like hospitals are coming to a standstill. On top of that, there's also a food shortage, and it's been confirmed that 25% of Cubans are unable to eat 3 meals a day. As a result, protests and expressions of dissatisfaction with the government are erupting all over Cuba. According to the monthly report from the Cuban Conflict Observatory, there were a total of 1,133 protests across Cuba in April. Violent crimes are rising, and the Cuban government continues to arrest citizens expressing dissatisfaction to stop this. However, since it's clear that pressure and sanctions from the United States will only intensify, the fundamental problems are not being resolved, and these protests are expected to become even more intense. Given the current situation, there's little reason for the United States to invade Cuba. The US already has enough ways to pressure Cuba without sending troops or spending heavily. The United States is currently cutting oil supplies, imposing financial sanctions, enforcing a shipping blockade, and pressuring foreign companies. Even with just these measures, the Cuban economy is collapsing at a very rapid pace. In fact, Cuba is experiencing power outages for more than 20 hours a day, and hospitals are having trouble operating. The shortages of food and medicine are also severe. Public dissatisfaction is growing quickly, and both anti-government protests and public security concerns are increasing at the same time. The United States is likely viewing this situation very coldly, because rather than risking international criticism, American casualties, or getting caught in a long-term guerrilla war by invading, it is much more efficient to destabilize the Cuban regime through economic pressure, especially since Cuba is so close to the US mainland. If an actual war were to break out, the political burden could become very heavy. This is why some in the US believe that even just maintaining the current situation will make it difficult for Cuba to hold out. And right now, the situation in Cuba is getting worse as time goes on. Power plants are shutting down due to fuel shortages, and the logistics network is faltering, blocking imports altogether. On top of that, major shipping companies have started suspending their routes to Cuba. If this situation continues, food shortages, unemployment, and social unrest are likely to become even more serious. The United States may judge that it can weaken the Cuban regime's control without even firing a shot. However, the problem is that under this pressure, Cuba is getting closer to Russia and Iran. The United States is likely seeing this as the most dangerous aspect. If Cuba continues to expand military cooperation with Russia and Iran and strengthens its drone capabilities right under the nose of the United States, the US may continue to increase the level of pressure. In fact, the main reason the United States is so sensitive about the Cuba issue right now is because of the distance. Cuba and Florida are only about 145 kilometers apart. By today's standards, that's a very short distance, especially when it comes to attack drones or small unmanned aerial vehicles. Recent wars have shown that even a few cheap drones can cause significant damage to warships or military facilities. In the war in Ukraine, drones have repeatedly flown deep into Russian territory, and in the Middle East, Iranian-backed forces have used drones to attack US bases and ships. The United States can't help but see the combination of these tactics with Cuba as extremely dangerous. The US is especially sensitive to threats near its own airspace and mainland. Even when a Chinese surveillance balloon appeared over the US, the military scrambled F-22 fighter jets to shoot it down. That's how seriously the US connects any military activity near its mainland to national security. Now, there are reports that attack drones with Russian and Iranian technology are being deployed in Cuba right under America's nose. For US security authorities, this is not something they can take lightly. Moreover, the United States has long regarded Cuba as a potential security threat. This is because, during the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. At that time, when the Soviet Union tried to deploy nuclear missiles in Cuba, the United States responded strongly, even imposing a naval blockade. Even though the current situation isn't at that level, there is a growing suspicion within the US that Russia and Iran are once again trying to use Cuba as a military outpost. If this trend continues, there is analysis suggesting that the US may further increase its pressure on Cuba. We'll have to wait and see how things develop, but right now, Cuba is preparing for war, and the United States cannot simply ignore Cuba. That much is clear.